Daniel thought it was just a game. The aliens called it the Trial of Harmony, a friendly challenge for visitors. They told him it was nothing serious, but the way the tall woman with silver eyes kept looking at him, it felt different. The hall was glowing with strange light. Hundreds of aliens stood in silence, watching his every move. The moment he stepped into the circle, the floor lit up under his feet. A warm energy wrapped around him like invisible hands. The crowd gasped. The woman leaned close and whispered, her voice shaking, "It is done. You are bound now, forever." Daniel froze. Bound to what? Bound to who and why? Did she suddenly call him her husband? Daniel had been on the alien world for only 3 days when the invitation came. He was still getting used to the air that shimmered faintly in the sunlight, the strange way the buildings seemed to grow out of the ground like living trees, and the soft hum that filled the streets at night. When the messenger appeared, dressed in long flowing robes covered with silver threads, Daniel assumed it was just another cultural greeting. The man bowed, handed him a crystal tablet, and left without a word. The message on the tablet was written in a language Daniel couldn't read, but a soft voice began speaking from it. It told him he had been chosen for something called the Trial of Harmony. It was described as a welcome rite for outsiders, a gesture of friendship. Daniel chuckled. To himself, he'd seen enough sci-fi movies to know this sort of thing usually meant a few harmless tests, maybe a puzzle, maybe some symbolic act, nothing to worry about. That evening, a tall woman came to his guest chamber. She had silver eyes that seemed to catch every bit of light in the room and hold it there. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, like she was choosing her words very carefully. She told him the trial would take place in the morning, and once it began, there was no leaving until it was finished. Daniel smiled politely, thinking it was just part of their ceremony's drama. He agreed without hesitation. Morning came, and he followed her through winding corridors until they stepped into an enormous hall. The ceiling was so high it seemed to vanish into mist. Strange glowing shapes floated above, moving slowly like clouds. The floor was smooth black stone, etched with swirling patterns that pulsed with faint light. Hundreds of aliens stood in a great circle, all watching him. The air was heavy with an energy he couldn't explain. Like the moment before a storm. The woman led him to the center of the hall. Her hand brushed his for just a moment, and he felt a strange warmth rush up his arm. She didn't look at him when she spoke, only said, "Remember, once the trial starts, it cannot be undone." Daniel gave a small nod, still thinking it was all just part of the act. A deep chime sounded, echoing around the hall. The patterns on the floor lit up beneath his feet, spreading outward like ripples on water. The aliens began chanting in low voices, a language Daniel didn't understand, but the rhythm of it seemed to move through his chest. The air shimmered more brightly now, and he felt something almost like invisible threads wrapping around him. Suddenly, a column of soft golden light rose up from the floor, surrounding him completely. It was warm, almost comforting, but it made his heart beat faster. He looked to the woman, hoping for some kind of explanation, but her expression had changed. She wasn't calm anymore. She looked conflicted. Then the crowd gasped. The chanting stopped, the golden light faded, and the hall seemed almost too quiet. The woman stepped closer, her silver eyes fixed on his, and her voice was barely more than a whisper. "It is done. You are bound now, forever." Daniel blinked, trying to understand. Bound to what? He asked, his voice low. Her lips parted, as if she might answer, but instead she said, "Bound to me." Before he could respond, the crowd erupted in cheers and strange musical tones that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The aliens began bowing to him, some speaking words he didn't know, others smiling warmly like he had just done something wonderful. Daniel tried to laugh, but it came out uneasy. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. The woman turned to the crowd, raising her hand. "Our new consort stands before you," she said, her voice now clear and strong. The word consort made Daniel's mind stumble. He turned to her, wanting to question it, but the celebration around them swallowed his words. Musicians began to play, and a procession formed to lead them out of the hall. Daniel found himself walking beside her, the air filled with sweet, unfamiliar scents, and the sound of soft bells. People reached out to touch his sleeve or place small glowing flowers at his feet. As they stepped into the sunlight, the alien city spread out before them, towers of crystal and glass, streets lined with plants that shimmered as they swayed. It was beautiful, but Daniel's thoughts kept circling back to what she'd said. Bound forever, consort, bound to me. They walked in silence for a while until he finally asked, "What exactly did I agree to?" Her silver eyes met his for a long moment, but instead of answering, she said softly, "You will understand tonight." A shiver went through him, not of fear exactly, but of something deeper, something he couldn't name. Around them, the city celebrated, but inside, Daniel felt the first real flicker of unease. He had thought this trial was just a formality. Now, he wasn't so sure. Daniel followed her through the bright streets, the sound of music still trailing. Behind them, every few steps, someone would stop and bow to him. Some offered him small gifts, delicate chains made of shimmering threads, fruit that glowed faintly in their hands, even folded pieces of cloth embroidered with strange symbols. He smiled politely and accepted them, though he had no idea what they meant. The woman Alara. He'd learned her name from the whispers of the crowd, walked slightly ahead, her long robes brushing the ground like moving silver. She didn't speak much, and Daniel couldn't decide if she was avoiding his questions or simply waiting for the right moment to answer. Her expression stayed calm, but there was something in her eyes he couldn't read. They entered a tall building with doors that opened silently at their approach. Inside, the air was cooler and scented faintly with something sweet and earthy. Soft light spilled down from above, making the walls glow. Alara led him into a smaller room, away from the murmuring of attendants who had followed them inside. Daniel set the gifts down on a low table, still unsure what to do with them. So he began, trying to keep his tone light. "When you said I was bound to you, what does that mean exactly?" Alara looked at him for a long time before answering. "The trial you agreed to is not just a welcome, it is a binding ceremony. Our people do not take such bonds lightly." Daniel laughed nervously. "You're saying I just married you, without even knowing?" She did not laugh. "In your words, yes. But here, the bond is more than marriage. It is a link, spiritual, emotional, sometimes even physical. We call it the soul union." Her words settled heavily between them. Daniel searched her face for any sign she was joking, but there was none. "And if I mean, what if I said I didn't want this?" he asked. Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "The bond has already formed. To break it would bring great dishonor to me, to you, and to both our peoples. It would cause unrest in the council." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing slowly across the room. "I thought this was going to be like a game, some cultural performance. I didn't think I was signing my life away." "You signed nothing," Alara said gently, "but you stepped willingly into the circle. That is enough." There was no anger in her voice, only a quiet certainty that made Daniel's chest tighten. He sat down, trying to process everything. Outside, faint sounds of celebration still drifted in through the open windows. A group of attendants entered carrying trays of food, fruits that shimmered as though touched by sunlight, small bowls of steaming grains, and cups of clear liquid that sparkled faintly. Daniel wasn't hungry, but he took a sip from the cup. It tasted like cold water with a hint of something floral. Alara remained seated across from him, watching. "There will be a feast tonight in your honor. The city will celebrate for 3 days. You will be introduced to the council as my consort." The word still felt strange to him, almost too formal to describe what had just happened. "Consort," he repeated. "So that means I'm part of the royal family now, in name, yes, in truth. The bond makes you more than that." He noticed the way her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she stood. "You will need to change. Robes will be brought to you. Wear them with care. Every detail will be noticed." Daniel found himself agreeing without argument, though his thoughts were still tangled. He didn't know if he was ready for any of this, but there was no pause button here. Things were moving forward, and he was being carried along with them. Later, when he stepped into the main hall again, dressed in deep blue robes lined with silver, the attendants bowed as he passed. He caught sight of himself in a polished wall. He hardly recognized the man looking back. The robe felt heavy, not from weight, but from meaning. Alara appeared beside him, now wearing a crown of thin crystal strands that caught the light like fire. She looked every bit the princess he had been told she was. Without a word, she offered her arm. He hesitated only a moment before taking it. As they walked toward the great hall where the feast was to be held, Daniel felt a strange pulse deep inside him, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. He glanced at Alara, wondering if she had felt it too. She didn't look at him, but a small, knowing smile touched her lips. The doors opened to reveal hundreds of guests, all turning to watch their entrance. The room was alive with music, scents, and colors that seemed almost unreal. Daniel stepped forward into the light, still unsure of what exactly he had become, but knowing that whatever it was, there was no going back. The feast hall glowed like a living jewel. Tall windows let in streams of soft blue light from the alien moons, and the walls themselves seemed to shift in gentle patterns, as if breathing. Dozens of long tables were filled with dishes Daniel had never seen before, fruits shaped like spirals, bowls of shimmering grains, and clear domes that held what looked like tiny floating lights. The music was low and steady, played by instruments that seemed to hum more than they strumed. Daniel walked beside Alara, feeling every pair of eyes follow them. The guests rose as they passed, bowing slightly before taking their seats again. He couldn't tell if their expressions were of respect, curiosity, or something else entirely. At the head of the hall, two large chairs waited. Alara guided him to the one beside hers. When he sat, the music stopped. An elder with hair the color of silver mist stood and raised his hands. His voice carried easily through the space, speaking in the alien tongue, each word deliberate and measured. Daniel caught only a few familiar sounds: his name, Alara's name, and a word he had heard earlier, bond. When the elder finished, all eyes turned to Daniel. Alara leaned toward him and whispered, "They wish to hear from you." Daniel cleared his throat, unsure what to say. "I am honored to be here," he began slowly, choosing each word with care. "Your world is beautiful, and I will do my best to understand your ways." It wasn't much, but Alara gave a small nod of approval, and the room erupted in a soft ripple of sound, something between applause and a song. The feast began. Servants moved gracefully between tables, placing plates before the guests. Daniel tried a piece of the spiral-shaped fruit. It tasted sweet at first, then left a cool freshness in his mouth. Alara ate quietly beside him, but he noticed she kept glancing toward a group seated near the far wall. They were dressed differently, darker robes, fewer ornaments, and they didn't join in the laughter that filled the room. Daniel leaned closer. "Who are they?" Her gaze lingered on the group a moment longer before she answered. "Council members. Not all of them were in favor of this union." He felt a faint unease. "Why?" She set her cup down. "Some believe humans do not belong here. They fear change." Daniel thought about the way the group's eyes had followed him since he entered. There was no open hostility, but the distance in their faces was unmistakable. He was about to ask more when a sudden flicker of something passed through him, an emotion that wasn't his own. It was quick, like the brush of a shadow, but it left his chest feeling tight. He looked at Alara. She was still smiling for the guests, but her fingers had curled slightly on the edge of the table. "Did you feel that?" he asked quietly. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, her smile faded. "That is the bond," she said softly. "You are beginning to sense me, and I can sense you." Daniel sat back, trying to process it. This was more than a symbolic link. It was real, tangible, alive. The thought was both fascinating and unsettling. As the night went on, the music grew livelier, and guests moved to the open space in the center to dance. Alara was drawn into the crowd by a group of young women in bright fabrics. Daniel stayed seated, watching her move with an effortless grace. She laughed at something one of them said, but through the bond, he caught a flash of something deeper, a quick, sharp feeling of worry. When she returned to her seat, he leaned closer. "You're hiding something," he said under his breath. She glanced at him, the smile still on her lips. "For anyone watching, tonight is for celebration," she murmured. We will speak tomorrow." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of colors and music, but Daniel's thoughts kept circling the same point: if the bond was real, then Alara couldn't completely hide what she felt. And if she was worried, it meant something was coming. Later, as the feast ended, they left the hall together. Outside, the air was cool and filled with the soft glow of floating lanterns. Drifting between the towers, the streets were quieter now, but a gentle hum seemed to rise from the ground, as though the city itself was alive. Alara led him through narrow walkways to a private garden. In the center was a pool of still water, reflecting the moons above. They stood there for a while, without speaking. Finally, she turned to him. "Daniel, there are things I must tell you, things I could not say before." Her voice was calm, but through the bond, he felt her heartbeat quicken. She was nervous, maybe even afraid, and he knew whatever she was about to reveal, it would change the way he saw everything that had happened so far. Daniel waited, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of flowers that glowed softly along the garden's edge. The moons above cast gentle light over the water, turning it into a mirror that reflected both their faces. Alara's gaze stayed on the pool as if it might help her find the right words. "When the trial of harmony is held," she began slowly, "those who stand in the circle are not chosen by chance. The bond must be accepted by both the spirits of our world and the one who steps forward." But there was more at play this time. Daniel listened, careful not to interrupt. He could feel a faint thrum in the bond, her emotions brushing against his own. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was weight behind it, something she had been carrying for a long time. "My position here is complicated," she said at last. "As the only daughter of the High Ruler, I am expected to marry into one of the noble houses to strengthen alliances. But there are those in the council who would use that union for themselves, not for our people's good." Daniel tilted his head. "So you chose me to stop that from happening?" She finally looked at him, silver eyes catching the moonlight. "Yes, by bonding with someone outside the noble houses. The agreement is sealed in a way they cannot challenge. No one expected me to choose a human. They will see it as strange, but they cannot undo it." The truth settled over him like a heavy cloak. He understood the logic, but there was still the reality. He had been brought into something far larger than he could see. "And you didn't think to explain this before the ceremony?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "If I had, you might have refused, and I could not risk that," she said softly. For a moment, silence filled the garden. Daniel didn't feel angry so much as uncertain. The bond between them pulsed again, carrying an unspoken thread of her own uncertainty. She had made a choice to protect herself, but it had tied both their lives together. They returned to the palace before the night was over. The corridors were quieter now, lit only by lines of soft white stones embedded in the floor. Attendants bowed as they passed, their eyes lingering on Daniel with curiosity and something else he couldn't name. The next morning, Daniel woke to find a folded robe placed neatly at the foot of his bed. The fabric shimmered between blue and green, depending on the light. A note rested on top in the flowing alien script, but a translation had been added for the council meeting. When he entered the great chamber later that day, the air was thick with expectation. The council sat in a wide semicircle, each member dressed in their house colors. The same group from the feast who had watched him with cool expressions were here, their eyes sharper now. Introductions were made, and Daniel found himself standing beside Alara at the center of the room. She spoke for a time in her own language, her voice steady and commanding. He didn't understand the words, but the way the council members shifted told him she was making her point clearly. Then one of the darker-robed members rose, speaking slowly, almost pointedly. Alara's shoulders tensed, and Daniel caught a flicker of her frustration through the bond. She turned to him and translated quietly. "They are asking if you have the strength to stand as my equal, if you can prove your worth in our traditions." Daniel looked at her. "And if I can't?" Her answer was simple. "Then they will demand the bond be dissolved." The chamber fell silent, waiting for his reply. Daniel felt every gaze pressing on him, some curious, some doubtful. He knew he couldn't back away, not here, not with the bond already tying them together. "Then I'll prove it," he said, the words steady despite the quickened beat of his heart. Alara's expression softened just slightly, and he felt a wave of something warm come through the bond approval, maybe even relief. The council members murmured among themselves before the dark-robed one finally nodded. The meeting ended, but Daniel knew this was only the start. As they left the chamber, he turned to Alara. "What exactly are they going to ask me to do?" Her reply was quiet, almost cautious. "They will give you a trial, but this time, it will not be one you can walk through without effort. And if you succeed," she paused, as if weighing the words, "then no one will ever question your place here again." Through the bond, Daniel could feel the truth of her statement, but also the shadow of something else, a challenge that might reveal more about this world and their connection than he was ready for. And yet, there was no part of him willing to step back. The days after the festival were strangely quiet. Leora's once bright eyes often seemed lost in thought, as if her mind kept wandering back to the evening under the glowing lanterns. The human Erin had noticed the subtle changes. She spoke less, lingered longer near the river, and seemed to study his face as though searching for something unspoken. Erin had no idea what it was she wanted to say, but he knew it was important. They often walked together at dusk now, their steps slow, the sound of the river filling the silences between them. On one of those walks, she stopped suddenly, her silver hair catching the last of the sunlight. "Do you ever feel," she asked softly, "like you're meant for something, but you can't yet see it clearly?" He thought about it, about the years before meeting her, how his days had been ordinary, predictable, maybe, he admitted. "But sometimes I think the thing we're meant for finds us instead of the other way around." She smiled faintly at that, though her eyes seemed a little sad. The truth was, Leora was carrying a secret. The elders had summoned her in private, their voices heavy with warnings. She was to keep her distance from the human. They claimed it was for his safety, but she sensed their real reason was different, something deeper, tied to an old agreement between her people and a distant council. Yet the more she tried to pull away, the more fate seemed to draw her back. To him, when the first autumn rains began to fall, she found herself at his door, drenched and shivering. Erin ushered her in without a second thought, wrapping a warm cloth around her shoulders. As they sat by the fire, she studied his hands, his voice, the way his presence seemed to anchor her wandering thoughts. There was something about him she couldn't explain, a calm strength that made her believe that no matter what the elders said, he was part of her path. But neither of them knew that their quiet moments were being watched. In the shadows beyond the village, two figures in long cloaks whispered to each other, their words carried away by the wind. One of them held a small device, glowing faint blue, a tracker pulsing with a signal that pointed straight to Leora, and far away, in a place she had hoped to forget, someone had just learned where she was. The camp was quiet that night, but it was not the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that made the air feel heavier, as if something unseen was watching from the shadows. The human sat near the dim fire, his thoughts lost in the events of the last few days. He had not planned for any of this. He had simply wanted to help when he first saw her being treated unfairly. But now, that simple act had tied him to her in ways he could not fully understand. The alien girl sat across from him, her posture still and her eyes fixed on the flames. Her hood was pulled back now, and in the faint light, the delicate patterns on her skin shimmered softly. They were not just marks, they seemed alive, shifting slightly as if responding to her mood. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was as if words would break the fragile balance holding them together. Finally, she lifted her gaze and said quietly, "I do not know how to repay you, but my people believe that some debts are not meant to be repaid in gold or gifts." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was determination beneath it. "You gave me something no one else dared trust." The human smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything. I didn't help you for a reward." He looked away for a moment, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "But maybe we both needed someone to believe in." Her lips curved into a small smile, the first genuine one he had seen from her since they met. But before the moment could settle, a soft rustle came from the trees beyond the camp. It was too deliberate to be the wind. She immediately grew tense, her patterns shifting into a darker hue. "They're here," she whispered. The human's heart quickened. Who, not enemies, she said after a pause, but those who would judge. They will want to see you, to see why I've chosen to stay close to you. The shapes emerged from the shadows, tall figures with the same shimmering skin as hers, their eyes assessing him with quiet curiosity. None spoke right away. The silence stretched until one of them, a figure adorned with intricate silver bands across their arms, stepped forward. You are the human she speaks of, the figure said, their tone carrying both challenge and intrigue. We have heard her words, but words are air. We wish to see the truth for ourselves. The human met their gaze without flinching. Then watch closely, he said simply. The girl's expression softened, as if his calm had somehow strengthened her. She moved to stand beside him, and for the first time, it was clear she was no longer the silent, guarded stranger he had first met. She was someone who had chosen to stand with him, even if it meant facing the scrutiny of her own people. As the night deepened, the firelight casting shifting shadows across their faces, an unspoken understanding formed between them. Whatever came next, neither of them would face it alone.